Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience. We are going to get started. My name is Jalitz Villegas, and I manage the Forced Marriage Initiative. Joining me today is Casey Carter-Swegman, Director of Public Policy. Together, we will discuss the intersection of forced marriage, human trafficking, and other forms of abuse. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families Office on Trafficking in Persons for funding this webinar. And thank all of you for bearing with our technical issues. This webinar has live American Sign Language interpretation, as well as Spanish language interpretation. To listen to this webinar in Spanish, please select the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and click on Spanish language. The Forced Marriage Initiative is a project of the Tahirih Justice Center. Tahirih is a national organization with offices in Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, Texas, and California. We provide immigrant survivors of gender-based violence with expert legal services and social services. We take an interdisciplinary approach to provide wrap-around services, giving each client an opportunity to meet with their immigration attorney, social services advocate, and in some offices, family law attorneys. We also have a robust public policy team and other programs to meet specialized needs, such as our Afghan Asylum Project. On today's webinar, we will discuss what forced marriage is and what it is not, and why forced marriage happens. We will focus on the intersection between forced marriage, human trafficking, and other forms of abuse. We will deepen our learning by discussing 2 case examples, and you will receive information on child marriage in the United States, and we will end by discussing warning signs and indicators of forced marriage. We will also have the opportunity to ask questions, and please feel free to utilize the chat and the question and answer options on the screen. By attending today's webinar, you'll receive a foundational understanding of forced and child marriage in the United States, recognize the intersectional nature of forced and child marriage, human trafficking, sexual assault, child abuse, stalking, female genital mutilation and cutting, as well as domestic violence. We will identify potential warning signs and indicators of forced and child marriage. Now, a little bit about the program that I manage, which is the Forced Marriage Initiative. This program was created in 2011 to respond to cases of forced marriage within the United States. Forced marriage is a global problem, and it is a problem here in the United States. Back then, given our organization's expertise supporting survivors of gender-based violence, we would get calls from service providers, from survivors, or individuals at risk who wanted help or needed help as a result of a forced marriage, but what they did not need was immigration legal services. And so we launched a national survey on this issue and learned of hidden cases of survivors, individuals not reporting children facing forced marriage. And from there, we launched our program. Our program serves individuals of all ages, backgrounds, and identities. We are here to help bring awareness to this form of abuse, provide technical assistance to anyone who is supporting a person at risk. We advocate for change at the legislative level. And most importantly, I'll reiterate, we work with individuals directly who are facing or who have faced this type of harm. We hope that you see us as a resource. And so, what do we mean by forced marriage? This slide illustrates the definition that truly grounds us in the work that we do at Tahirih. This is a widely used definition. And so when we say forced marriage, we mean a marriage where one or both people do not or cannot consent. And typically, this involves elements of force, elements of fraud, or coercion. At Tahirih, we do not equate a forced marriage with an arranged marriage in every instance. An arranged marriage is a process in which families may take the lead, but the ultimate choice to marry remains with the individual. We understand that this is our working definition and that individuals with lived experience may describe or they may label their situation differently. It is essential in our work with survivors, with individuals at risk, to allow space for them to name their experience for themselves. Essentially, what we are looking for when someone is discussing a relationship or a marriage process is if there is full and free consent. And when we're talking about consent or choice, it is not just about the individual that they are being introduced to. It is also about the timing of the marriage and even the idea of marriage altogether. And we do see cases from time to time where someone tells us, I agreed to my parents arranging the marriage, or I agreed to the person they introduced me to, but they said that I could wait until I finished college and I'm still in high school, right? Which can be really scary if at some point you thought you had control and then things change. And so when we're talking about consent, lack of consent can be identified if the individual is younger than the legal age to marry, if they are subject to incapacity or disability that may impact their full understanding of what they are agreeing to or their full understanding of the process that they are in. And as the forced marriage definition states, we're naming force, fraud, or coercion. Some common examples used um, to share what force or coerce someone to comply can be family members, maybe stating that they will end their own life, they will harm themselves if the marriage does not go forward. Being told that if the marriage does not happen, they will lose financial support. That is very common in the cases that we have worked on where clients are wanting to go to college, right? And being told, well, you won't be able to, you will lose financial support if you do not comply to the marriage demands. Partners or other abusers threatening to share explicit photos if they do not agree to marriage or to remain in the marriage. We have also learned of individuals signing documents that they do not fully understand, and to their surprise, they find themselves legally married. And so to ensure that this is very clear as a foundation, understanding of this issue, when we are talking about consent in the process, we mean at all levels. Consent, again, is not just about the individual who is being introduced, but also considering the timing. or the idea of getting married at all. Consent should be across the board. So it should be yes to the idea of marriage, yes to the timing, and yes to the person. And of course, the ability to express wishes without negative consequences should also be a yes. This next graphic provided to us by Vidya 3, a survivor who was at Harvard at the time that she created the continuum with Darakshan Raja, who worked at the Urban Institute at the time, gives a better idea as to how this change can occur. But please know this is not a perfect image, and these changes do not always occur in this linear way. But I do think it helps us to capture the idea that a person can begin in what they feel is an arranged marriage process, but over time, they may find that their wishes or their ability to express preferences or to even reject potential suitors that they do not see as a good fit be dismissed, or perhaps be told that they are being too difficult, or that they or their family is now getting a bad reputation. Sometimes this may mean even being threatened with not being able to marry altogether, or be told that their refusal to marry is costing their siblings, to ruining their chances about them, being able to marry. It is at the point where we're seeing family dismiss the individual's wishes to not marry, to not select the person they have chosen, the idea of marriage, you're not able to reject it, or their desire again to wait until they're done with school or done with college, that we are now seeing things progress because again, consent is being dismissed, which is key.
Halitz, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to flag that our first poll question did go up. And would we like folks to just minimize that or share results now or continue with the presentation?
Casey, you're more than welcome to look into the poll. I do not see it on my end, but if you'd like
Okay.
to share a bit about what you see from folks finding, that's perfectly fine. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Halitz. And so it's really interesting, and I think it's a great transition into our next piece of the conversation around the difficulties in naming when you are and are not potentially dealing with a forced marriage situation. The question, as a reminder for folks, was, have you ever worked on a case of forced marriage or with forced marriage dynamics? We had 102 people respond. Thank you for those who engaged with the survey. 16% of folks said they were unsure. 27% of folks said yes, and a little over half of folks said no. And so I think the purpose of this portion of the presentation in particular is to help those who are unsure get more clarity, and to help those who may have said no maybe think back and question whether or not there may have been underlying dynamics that we didn't have the tools or the questions for. So I'm going to share these results really quickly from my end so folks can see them, and then I'll stop sharing and pass it right back to you, Halitz.
Thank you so much, Casey. I really appreciate you pausing us to go over those results, because I do think it's will be really helpful for this next slide, especially in thinking about how the line between arranged and forced marriage can seem blurry. And it's blurry for us as service providers. It's blurry, or can be, for community members, and even for the individual themselves, right? You maybe working with someone, and perhaps a new case, and you find that that individual may be married or engaged suddenly, or they return from a trip married, engaged, and or pregnant. And so when we're talking about forced marriage, we're talking about marriages that may have already happened or may happen in the future. We can have a lot of assumptions as to why someone is married suddenly, or why perhaps they may disengage from services. And as we think about how to offer support, I like for folks to think about how your organization does intake processes or assessment processes, and think about if it includes or excludes questions related to how someone's marriage may come to be or how it happens within their family. Perhaps we can identify ways to enhance our processes to offer support from the very beginning and make things less blurry for everyone. The key findings from the 2011 survey, I think, may challenge some of the assumptions and ideas that we may have about what a victim of forced marriage typically looks like. Tahirih received over 500 responses from service providers in 47 states, and the survey results found that the forced marriage affected families of diverse backgrounds and faiths. Survivors that were identified came from at least 56 countries, and they varied in citizenship and immigration status. Our program has also served individuals with no immigrant tie, and to this day, we continue to see women and girls, or those perceived to be women and girls, most targeted. The weddings can happen in the US or abroad, and many at risk are under the age of 18. Or they state that the grooming process started before the age of 18. By this point, we get this question: why would anyone be forced into a marriage, or why do forced marriages happen? And the answer to that question is honestly complex. The reasons are many, and they vary depending on family and on the individual. Not every case that we encounter is the same, even if folks are from the same or similar community. Our own beliefs, our own traditions, societal norms play a role in deciding what is tolerated or what is okay in one's household or prohibited in another. The reasons are complex and can vary, again, depending on the individual family. What we have tried to do with this slide is illustrate with the larger circle how community level and societal level factors that are present across cultures and communities, how they are just some of the root causes for why forced marriage exists as a tool of power, a tool of control and oppression. And then we relate those to the image of the magnifying glass, which includes the individual and the family level triggers that can be that case-specific motivation for a forced marriage. A woman may be from a community with strong feelings towards control of female sexuality, and rumors about her dating history or promiscuity may be enough. That perception may be enough for that particular family to move ahead with the marriage process. If what they are valuing is, saving, their reputation, but that may not be the case for someone else. Those family level triggers are key. As we think about the coercive tactics that individuals at risk face, I'll focus on highlighting the ones that are, I would say, more prevalent with the cases that we work on. Emotional blackmail is one that for advocates may not seem that serious, but it really is incredibly difficult. And these type of situations take a heavy toll on those we work with. Feeling like you are responsible for hurting your family, for hurting their reputation, for ruining or shaming your parents takes great emotional pain, and that emotional blackmail is used again as a tactic to get the person to comply. Social ostracism is another very common tactic. If you can think about, always being around your family. Perhaps you go to school with family members. Perhaps you go to church or temple with family members. You're always in the same community, and you are told that if you refuse, that you are going to be kicked out of the community. You will be, in some cases, seen as dead to your family. That is very scary and a very sad um, uh, thing to process, to think about truly, being new and out in the world. Death threats are certainly common, immigration-related threats. Even if folks do have immigration status or stable immigration status, they may not know what that means. They may never have been allowed to hold their documents. And so all of these are examples of what individuals at risk experience. The case dynamics often involve decision paralysis. Folks are worried about seeking help or taking action. Again, we're talking about a type of harm that is often perpetrated by family members, by loved ones. And often survivors tell us that they want the abuse to stop, and often they do not want to harm or see harm to their parents. And so it is incredibly tough to make a decision and to think about what that will mean. And again, often that could mean also losing contact with your family, especially in situations where there is a high lethality threat. At this point, Casey, I'm going to ask you to take over and guide us through the historic and related trauma. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Halitz, and kudos to you for managing all of the tech challenges and working us through the early part of this presentation so gracefully. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me and see me okay. Thank you, Halitz.
Thank
So
you.
again, I'm Casey Carter-Swegman. I'm the Director of Public Policy here at the Tahirih Justice Center. For a very long time at Tahirih, I was working in direct service, and so throughout this presentation, I'll be reflecting on my time doing that work as well, even though the majority of my focus now is on changing state and federal laws to better prevent and respond to the needs of these unique survivors. So what we're trying to achieve with this slide is to really drive home the fact that forced marriage is a form of violence against women in and of itself. When an individual feels they have no real choice when it comes to marriage, they lose a great deal of power and control over their own life. But forced marriage is often not happening in a silo. It is a form of violence against women in its own right, but it is often intersecting with a lifetime experience of child abuse and neglect, rape and sexual assault, domestic violence and family violence, stalking. In some communities, it can also intersect with female genital mutilation or cutting. And as we will dive into in much greater detail later in this presentation, sometimes cases of forced marriage can have elements of human trafficking, and sometimes cases of human trafficking will have a forced marriage component to them. Just to unpack this a little bit more, we talk about this a lot in our work, but the majority of the time, no matter what age someone comes to us for help, they have experienced a lifetime of oppression in their household, expectation setting that they will not have control over their marriage process, sometimes being told they will be taken out of school if they refuse a marriage of their family's choosing, being restricted from food and other activities in an effort to get someone to acquiesce to their fate. We also see rape and sexual assault being both a cause and a consequence of forced marriage. What I mean by that is, in certain cases, individuals will experience a rape or a sexual assault, and in that particular family or community, what they see as the quote unquote best way to handle that situation is to get those individuals married to each other to protect the perpetrator from prosecution and to ensure that any child that comes of that scenario is born to married parents. Misguided attempts to, what our clients would say, put a bow on a bad situation. And I think it naturally follows in these cases that the majority of clients who come to us share that the threat of an actual experience of rape and sexual assault is immediate. On the wedding night, consummation is often expected and forced, and then they have ongoing and at times lifelong access to that individual where non-consensual sexual contact is happening within that marriage. Domestic and family violence, I think, is probably quite obviously present in these circumstances, both prior to the marriage in the family of origin, and then later on in the marriage relationship. We don't need to unpack that in great detail. Many folks who are on today have a deep understanding of the dynamics of domestic and family violence and the ways in which tactics are used to exert power and control over people, especially young people. Stalking in these cases is a bit unique. Often family members, community members, and other enforcers of norms have pretty natural proximity to these individuals. They often go to school with their family members, go to the same houses of worship, go to the same locations in and around the community. And all of their behaviors are reported back to their family. We have had clients say they were reported for talking to a friend or talking to a school counselor, and that raised their family's suspicions that they were reaching out for help, and then they were told they couldn't go to school anymore or they couldn't see that person anymore. And so while it doesn't often look like stalking in the traditional sense, they are using these natural moments of proximity to make someone feel like they are always being watched. Everything they do is being reported back to their potential perpetrators, and they are trapped and have no way of reaching out for help. Female genital mutilation and cutting could be a presentation in and of itself. Just flagging here that it's important to recognize the ways in which in some communities, the experience of FGMC is a precursor to marriage. It's a foundational belief that an individual is not yet marriage material or marriageable until they have undergone that procedure. And so if someone is coming forward and expressing a fear of or a past experience with FGMC, you're going to want to screen for the potential for forced marriage or coerced marriage in their life. And likewise, if someone is coming forward about a threat of a forced marriage or an experience with a forced marriage and comes from a community where FGMC is known to be practiced, you're going to want to flag that too and ask the right questions so that all of their needs are met. Medical, mental health, physical safety, you name it. This is an opportunity to screen for and then respond to all of the needs that the survivor might have. So we see these two forms of harm as red flags for each other. And now to get to the heart of this presentation, right? This is why we're all here. We had a great question from Marissa in the Q&A section and another one in the chat recently. And so to get sort of to this point of the ways in which forced marriage and human trafficking overlap and the ways in which they don't, and how to make that distinction and talk about that distinction with survivors and help them name for themselves what is happening to them. So the question of, isn't forced marriage just a form of human trafficking, does come up often. What we see in our work is that often the dynamics do not raise to the level of a state or a federal definition of trafficking. We're not seeing exploitation or financial gain as the primary motivator. While there can be things like bride prices or dowry, or a relief of a debt, a long-standing debt within the family. Often the monetary gain is not the motivator for the family to pressure that person into marriage. While some cases do have elements of human trafficking, especially when we're looking at situations that manifest much more like servile marriage. Someone is married, they're sent to live in their spouse's home with in-laws and extended family of their spouse, then forced to work from sunrise to sunset and even later, doing domestic work, watching children, and never allowed rest and never given compensation for that work. Then we see, situations where we might name that as forced labor. There are other situations where individuals can be forced to work without compensation in a family business. We'll unpack that a little more later. But again, they are not a one-to-one, but it is very important to recognize the moments when they do overlap, because recognizing that can sometimes open doors to services that are available for survivors of human trafficking and vice versa. And this Venn diagram, I think, helps folks to kind of wrap their arms around the similarities and the differences. I think one really important piece of this equation is that many times forced marriage is an illegal act performed through legal systems. Exploitation under the guise of marriage can be very hard to name for the survivor, as well as for all of the systems that are touching the lives of these survivors. And so with that, I think this is our moment where we were going to pause and open it up for some reflections from participants. Halitz, did you want folks to put comments in the chat or in the Q&A?
Thank you, Casey. However, folks would like to contribute, just your thoughts on what we've covered thus far, and we'll move along quickly for the sake of time, but certainly want to hear from folks.
So I do see one question from Lindsay in the Q&A. If we want to answer that, Halitz, the question is, when death threats occur, concerns about honor killing specifically, what kind of protections are offered through Tahirih or from law enforcement? With every case, we are doing lethality assessments, and we are working with the survivor to talk about options that are available to them. With every survivor, the option to engage with and report to law enforcement is always on the table. And with minors in particular, who are at heightened risk, of course, we would be leaning on law enforcement when we felt the risk of lethality was high. We also have a question from Elizabeth. The federal definition of trafficking now includes involuntary servitude without explicit monetary gain, implied gain by the value of domestic labor, and added without consent. I think this is a question for, probably an expert attorney in human trafficking. I think that could be a very valuable argument to make if you were working with a survivor who did not have status and was seeking humanitarian relief through the T visa program. I think in these cases, one of the things that we are often working through with survivors and have heard from different communities is that the label of trafficker upon their parents and loved ones does not feel helpful or empowering. And the label of trafficking victim upon them may lead, in fact, to further shame, isolation, ostracization. And so we are careful about the ways in which we talk about putting labels on survivors or their personal situations, and mostly are looking to these kinds of definitions or digging into these dynamics in order to see what potential empowerment can come from that conversation, what potential services or doors can open for them based on that conversation. And so this is just another chart to lay out sort of the ways in which people are talking about human trafficking. We will share the link. But again, we have this action, means, and purpose. And some of these things can, be defined a bit more flexibly over time and maybe evolving. But again, when we're talking about these dynamics happening within a family, and when we're talking about families whose motivations are often deeply rooted in the preservation of entrenched patriarchal gender roles, control over female sexuality, and not always seeing commercial sex exploitation, labor, or services present in those cases, it's important to understand the nuances as well as the overlap. And so I think, we've talked about this top bullet already. We do see some cases where they are, their financial motivations for the family or the perpetrators of forced marriage. And again, I think, Khalid, we can move forward for the sake of time because we've talked about some of those dynamics already.
Thank you, Casey. I will read over a case scenario. Dina's parents exercised a great deal of control over her life. When they believed it was in her best interest to marry, the process moved quickly, and her opinions were dismissed. Once married, Dina moved to her husband's home and was expected to work at his family restaurant. Dina worked taxing shifts back to back, day in and day out, without pay and little to no breaks. One day, when she was sick, Dina tried to stay home, but the restaurant was located right below her apartment, and her husband dragged her to work. Dina had no one to talk to. The other employees were also family members, and they had fewer challenging shifts and were paid. And so, with this scenario, I like to ask folks if this feels like a clear-cut case of labor trafficking to you. Why or why not? And Casey, I look to you as I'm unable to view the chat or Q&A.
So in the chat, we have a few folks who say, yes, this does look like trafficking to me. She's being forced to work without compensation. Without a doubt, folks are saying, yes, this sounds like labor trafficking.
Sounds like folks see this as a clear-cut case of labor trafficking. Let's look at the next scenario. When Lisa began her college education, she was thrilled. Lisa was an excellent student and enjoyed helping her classmates. One day, Lisa's brother used her computer and noticed several emails from male classmates. He told their parents, who felt the messages were inappropriate and evidence that Lisa was forgetting their values. Fearing Lisa would get a bad reputation, which would impact future marriage prospects, the family decided to move her marriage process forward. Lisa objected, but feared she would not be allowed to continue her education unless she agreed. Lisa was married to a man of her parents' choosing and moved to her in-laws' home. They demanded she do all household chores, cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, and anything else they requested. If Lisa ever objected, she would not be allowed to leave the home for weeks at a time, and her privileges were taken away. Same question. Does this feel like a clear-cut case of labor trafficking to you? Why or why not?
We're seeing, yes, these are forced labor services with threats and coercion. Yes, and possibly kidnapping. Yes, clear civil rights violations. Yes, coercion is very present. Yes, very clear. Also, yes, this is coercive behavior, holding captive, emotional blackmail, controlling behavior, to name a few.
I'm happy to see folks say yes, and I'll share that in cases that are similar, the spotting of these type of harms has not been so clear cut, especially when someone is maybe coming forward and not naming all of the abusive pieces together, right? Saying that my family is making me do household chores, but perhaps not going into detail. Casey, would you like to just share a little bit more as to how uh, this one can at times be difficult for folks?
Yes, I think we are dealing with a lot of experts today in the presentation, which is fantastic. And what I was just typing into the chat, but I'm happy to share here, is that we have had individuals referred to us with exactly these dynamics from folks who should have been able to identify this as a case of human trafficking, but who have instead said, these are family or cultural issues. These are private matters. It is not for us to intervene because it's happening within the family. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we still come up against. Yes, Tanya, family secrets. As advocates, when trying to get systems to react, when trying to get the systems to respond appropriately. And lots of folks are reflecting in general in the chat around the challenges of labor trafficking survivors getting the justice that they deserve, getting the recognition from the systems that they deserve. And I think when we're seeing it happening, especially within a family unit under the guise of marriage, that advocates that are maybe not expert in these issues, folks who have not been trained, might easily dismiss this as that's a family issue, that's a cultural issue. We don't touch that.
Thank you so much, Casey. I'll add that uh, just reflecting on what you shared earlier about the individuals we work with often not wanting to be labeled as trafficking victims out of fear of what that would mean to them or their communities. As service providers, I do think it's important to think about how potentially we can utilize those dynamics, those definitions to perhaps open doors to services. Often we are able to utilize those tactics shared and trafficking definitions for service provision. And again, it is a conversation to have with those we're working with, and perhaps it's not as clean cut, but certainly may be a way of opening doors to services. I think the 5-minute stretch break would be beneficial. Casey, what do you think? I know we have our interpreters on. Just a
Yes,
brief.
I think out of respect for our interpreters, we should take a break.
Thank you. Okay, folks, a quick 5-minute stretch break, and then we'll be right back on. Thank you to everyone for hanging in there. Thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate your time and your expertise. We love you utilizing the chat and the Q&A. We'll be back in 5 minutes and hopefully wrap us up close to the scheduled time. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you enjoyed that short break. And now we're going to dive in a little bit deeper on the legal landscape. Casey, I'm going to pass it to you for these first few slides.
Sure thing, and I can speak slowly but go quickly so that we can end on time. The good news is that we did have a big win on this issue in the 2022 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. For the first time in history, we have defined forced marriage as a form of harm that is occurring in the United States in the Violence Against Women Act, which has opened the doors for lots of new recognition and potential funding streams to support this work and these survivors. Right now, there is no forced marriage specific criminal law on the federal level, and it is unclear whether that is something that advocates and survivors would coalesce around as a useful tool to prevent and respond versus other investments. The de facto minimum legal age for a US citizen to sponsor, or a legal permanent resident for that matter, to sponsor a spouse or a fiance is 18, but there is no set minimum age for the foreign beneficiary. So what we have seen in the data is that incredibly young children, most of them girls, have been brought over as spouses and fiancés of much older men in the United States. We are working as we speak to fix that loophole in immigration laws to better protect girls here and abroad. Right now, there is a hodgepodge of federal and state criminal laws relating to domestic violence, child abuse, stalking, kidnapping, and unlawful restraint that, depending on where the crime happened and whether or not the forced marriage crossed borders, may apply in some of these cases. At the state level, we do have a memo on this if you are curious if your state falls into this category. But there are 9 states and 2 jurisdictions that specifically have criminal offenses addressing forced marriage. Many of those statutes do find themselves embedded within the statutes on human trafficking. Some only apply to children, some only apply to those who identify as women and girls. They are imperfect statutes much of the time. And as far as we know, we have not seen a prosecution of the crime of forced marriage. But it is a tool to be aware of. So an example of state-based remedies that do exist. So we have this Florida statute here. Any person who knowingly or in reckless disregard of the facts engages in human trafficking or attempts to engage in human trafficking or benefits financially by receiving anything of value from participation in the venture that has subjected a person to human trafficking, for labor or services of any child under the age of 18 commits a felony in the first degree, or uses coercion or labor or for labor or services of an adult commits a felony in the first degree. So given the case scenarios that we saw before. Maybe this could be sort of all encompassing. And then if we jump down, we do have this definition of services in Florida that encompasses forced marriage. So we see here, services means any act committed at the behest of, under the supervision of, or for the benefit of another. And this term includes, but is not limited to, forced marriage, servitude, or the removal of organs, which is an interesting mix of terms. But for once, yes, I see Tanya saying something in the chat, yay, Florida. In this space, we see Florida, in fact, sort of ahead of the pack in terms of recognizing this form of abuse. We also have a different type of approach in the state of Texas. So another sort of surprising leader in this space, we were able to successfully get forcing or coercing a child to enter into a marriage defined as child abuse and neglect in the state of Texas when we were working on our bill to raise the minimum marriage age. It is the only state that explicitly names this as a form of child abuse and neglect and puts it squarely within the mandate of Child Protective Services. One of the tools that this statute put in the toolkit of that system is the ability for any protective adult in that child's life to take out a child abuse prevention order in order to prevent the forced marriage of a child. So that would be me or Halitz or their best friend's mom. Anyone in their life could intervene through this civil procedure to get a prevention order to prevent that forced marriage.
Thank you, Casey. We would not do this issue justice if we did not speak about child marriage. As someone who works directly with individuals at risk, I recognize that children, young people who face this type of abuse are often left without many options. There are many states in the United States where child marriage is legal. We at Tahirih do not claim that every child marriage is a forced marriage. But what the data tells us is that the majority of cases have concerning factors. Between 2000 and 2018, 300,000 minors were married. Although we can't say that every one of those marriages were forced, when we broke down the data, we learned about extremely concerning points. The vast majority of cases involved girls marrying adult men, and some of those men were decades and decades older. The marriage ages were lower than the age of consent, meaning in some states, girls were marrying before they legally could consent. And parental consent exceptions enable parental coercion. The good news, since we launched the first campaign in 2016 in the movement to end child marriage in the United States, the movement has truly grown. We have seen many states strengthen their laws and continue to advocate for change. Now, what the US-specific research does show us is that, in general, child marriage is just bad public policy. Whatever a girl's starting point, child marriage truly stacks the odds against her. It increases her instability over time. You will see higher dropout rates, increased medical and mental health problems, and in all of the cases handled by our program, that's over 1,000 now, the majority of those cases involved suicidal ideations or suicide attempts. Now, moving us ahead to ensure that we are on time to protect everyone's time, the next few slides are highlighting some warning signs. And I'm happy to speak with folks one-on-one about these warning signs. I'll flag a couple uh, and move us ahead to, I think, a crucial piece, which is survivor-centered approach. When it comes to family history, a unusual warning sign that we have learned is the death of a parent. We have seen when a parent who perhaps was protective in an abusive, marriage, so one protective parent passes away, that may be a trigger as that protective parent is now gone. But we have also seen situations where, a parent who is truly ill believes that it is their responsibility to see their children married before they pass away. And so when someone mentions the death of a parent or a truly critically ill parent, that is a warning sign. The health issues I've covered, and Casey already discussed a bit about um, uh, earlier unwanted pregnancy, or perhaps we can mix that in when you think about the intersection of rape and sexual assault. Moving us ahead, the law enforcement issues, I believe, are very common to those who work in the movement to end gender-based violence, right? So often folks are known to police. And in these cases, families just utilize the systems against folks, right? So they may let the police know that they have a troubled child or they're not taking their medication. And so when that person needs help, they are known to quote unquote be a troublemaker. With education and employment issues, the big one to flag here, besides just sudden changes in behavior, is the fear of upcoming breaks. And that one is important because families may utilize those breaks to travel or for the marriages to occur as those protective teachers, or counselors are no longer there. You may be wondering, how do you ask someone if they're facing a forced marriage? And before you ask, the most important thing is that you truly need to ground yourself in a non-judgmental point of view and starting a conversation that is based on trust and mutual respect. You do not have to have all of the answers, but at least be equipped with resources and with referrals. Think that that may be your only chance to speak with that person. We see our role as a role of prevention and healing. For those of you on the call who are service providers, this is a very unique way of being in the prevention space. It is not often when we know that a future harm is going to happen, and when we're able to potentially stop that, help someone before that future marriage happens, that future sexual assault, that future unwanted pregnancy occurs. And so again, it is very important to take advantage of the time when folks are speaking with us and think about how we can incorporate questions related to how marriage occurs in their family and how or they feel about that for themselves. We believe that it's important to educate on rights and options. There's no religion that sanctions forced marriage. Folks have a right to say no to a marriage or partner that they do not want, regardless of their age, of their identity, or their background. When you're thinking about ways to ask, again, once you ground yourself in that non-judgmental point of view, think about a conversation. Think about asking if they are being pressured to marry someone who they do not want or are unsure about. And when you're asking these questions, think about what are the warning signs that are leading you to asking, right? There's a reason why you're asking. What have they told you before? Or what is it that is concerning to you, right? Do they feel they have a choice in deciding who they will marry? That's an easy one, I think, that could be added to assessment or intake protocols, right? If you are a service provider that asks about family, we can ask about how marriage occurs within the family and how do they feel about that for themselves. And that can give us an idea as to what is going on without being perhaps, bringing up, maybe some fearful feelings. Ultimately, we want folks to take a survivor-centered approach. And as much as we want to help, we recognize that it is their life. Folks are truly thinking about leaving potentially the only home or community they have ever known, right? They may lack in life experiences regardless of age. They could fear for their friends, for siblings, for pets. And again, we are talking about situations where there's lots of conflicted feelings, where one is in conflict with loved ones, but also does not want to harm them and is, thinking about their own future and how, do they live in this space with all of this, right? Thinking about their own identity and certainly worried about what seeking help actually means and what it will do to their family. We always say to be prepared for second thoughts. I like to say that if you were a domestic violence shelter provider and you were working with a survivor and then they left and returned to the abusive situation, we would never say they could not come back to shelter or receive services. And so be prepared. Sometimes you may plan everything out with someone at risk and then they change their mind. And it is our job to remain non-judgmental, to remain a resource, because we just never know when they may need us again. I appreciate everyone's time. I like to pause here for some questions and answers. I know we've covered quite a few as we went along, and I love if we can populate the second poll and see if any of the questions, of the answers, excuse me, may have changed for folks. And Casey, I invite you to come on video and let me know what you see in the chat or in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Leeds. I was just responding to a good question around the distinction between child marriage and forced marriage and reflecting on, some of the rare instances that we have seen in the data and individuals, including the lead sponsor of a bill to end child marriage in Missouri right now, who have reflected that they did marry underage. They married a close in age peer whom they felt in love with at the time. While it did not have a positive outcome and they regret the decision now and know that it is bad public policy to allow children to marry, there are rare instances where survivors of child marriage do not identify with forced marriage as a term or as a label. What we know, though, is whatever the starting point, child marriage has negative and devastating consequences. And most of the time, it is not too close in age peers in a Romeo and Juliet situation. And we would ask those who do feel that way to wait in order to protect the majority of young people who are facing the threat of child marriage via coercion and force.
Casey, is there another question or comment in the chat that you would like to highlight?
Nope, that's all that we see in the chat. And right now we have seen a decrease in the number of folks who answered unsure to the question of whether or not you have worked on a case of forced marriage. And interestingly, a bit of an increase in folks. Oh, people are still answering. Actually, I think the outcome on the yes and the no has remained about the same, but a nice to see a decrease in the amount of folks who are responding as unsure.
Thank you. I hope this highlights for folks the need to dive deeper, especially when we're working with individuals at risk or those with lived experience. It's our goal to streamline this issue and for folks to ask early on and think about our own intake processes and what we don't ask. I know I myself, as a victim advocate early on in the domestic violence space, did not ask about forced marriage. And as I reflect now, I truly believe I did work with individuals who were facing this type of harm. I just never asked about the onset of their marriage. I'd like to thank everyone for bearing with us, our interpreters, my colleagues here, everyone providing support, and all of you who attended. I want to remind folks that we are happy to provide one-on-one technical assistance, whether you are working with someone or you just have questions or you want additional training support, materials, or perhaps you are working with someone but you cannot share their information. We can work with you. We can answer your questions without you needing to break confidentiality, or you can refer folks directly to us. The email is fmi@tahirih.org, and the phone number that is on this slide, that's the 571-282-6199, is for our program directly. So thank you to everyone. I truly appreciate your time, and I really do look forward to hearing from you, and would love to see you all email and learn more about what you are seeing on the field, and really support our work with the sharing of information so that all survivors are getting the services that they truly deserve. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.